The president spent a lot of time in his speech proudly outlining the progress the administration has made when it comes to the U.S. economy. Trade, though, looms large when it comes to Wall Street's outlook for the economy and an outlook for corporate profits. And I'm wondering, as this is prolonged, as this process keeps going on, do you acknowledge that perhaps this could be a drag on that progress that President Trump outlined so proudly last night?
Well, first, let me just say the U.S. economy continues to perform extremely well. And really, we see a slowdown in Europe and other parts of the world, but the U.S. economy is still very strong. And that's really as a result of the president's economic program, which has always been tax reform, regulatory relief, and trade. And we're very pleased. Ambassador Lighthizer negotiated a great deal with USMCA, and that's one of the things we'll be looking for Congress to pass.
Are you on your way to Beijing in a couple weeks, and how are you setting up for that meeting at this point? What's your outlook? Wall Street wants a deal, obviously. What can you tell Wall Street?
Well, we had very productive meetings last week here in D.C. with the Vice Premier. Ambassador Lighthizer and myself and a large team are on our way to Beijing next week. We are committed to continue these talks. We're putting in an enormous amount of effort to try to hit this deadline and get a deal. So that's our objective.
What does a deal look like? I mean, I think that parts of it, tariffs, when it comes to tariffs, it could, in theory, be easy to say tariffs will be halted in terms of the escalation of tariffs, or tariffs could be lifted. The other parts of it, in terms of structural reform, are really big, much bigger, thornier issues. So can you tell us what a quote-unquote deal could look like when you come away from those talks, and whether tariffs will always be in place as long as the structural issues remain outstanding?
Well, we are trying to reach a comprehensive agreement on a large range of issues. Now, the good news is we have been talking about these issues for over the last year. These are everything from structural issues to forced technology issues to the long list of issues that were in the 301 report. And we are also very focused on free and fair trade for U.S. companies to have access there, and to have a more level playing field, which will bring down the trade deficit.
Mr. Secretary, it's Brian Sullivan. What happens if the USMCA is not approved? What happens then if there's no NAFTA, effectively?
Well, I'm not going to really comment on what would happen if it's not approved, because this is something that Ambassador Lighthizer has worked very closely with both the Republicans and the Democrats. It's really an enormous step forward on a long range of issues. So I really don't see why this wouldn't be approved unless we get to a situation where the Democrats just refuse to bring it to the floor. As long as the Democrats bring this to the floor, I think we're highly confident this will be passed.
Mr. Secretary, I want to bring it back to China and this notion that, you have been talking about these bigger structural reforms for the large part of a year now. That really underscores the notion that these are very hard issues to deal with. So given a March 1st deadline, Mr. Secretary, can you envision a scenario in which the tariffs are halted or even lifted, even as these structural issues are still being worked out?
Well, I don't think it would be productive to speculate on the outcome, because we have a lot of work left to do. But as I've mentioned, there are a wide range of issues. We're working round the clock. If we can't get to the deadline, it's not because we haven't worked round the clock. I think there's a big commitment on both sides to try to meet this deadline, and we're working under the direction of President Trump and President Xi. So hopefully we'll continue to make progress.
Mr. Secretary, so from your perspective, are the set of issues that you need as a threshold for making an agreement with China already on the table? Do you know which negotiating points right now are in play to get to that March 1st deadline?
Well, one of the areas we made a lot of progress on last week was the area of enforcement. One of the things that's very important to us is if there is a deal, that it's an enforceable deal. We don't want this to be an agreement that's not enforced. We have a fundamental understanding on that. We need to do a little bit more work on the mechanism. But there are a lot of issues here. We're making good progress. There's still a lot of work to do, and I look forward to our trip next week.
The purchase of soybeans, the offer to buy 5 million tons of soybeans when the Chinese delegation was here not too long ago, was touted as progress, maybe the Chinese willing to make a deal. Some people look at it a different way, that it's interesting, there's some irony wrapped up in the fact that this is being touted as progress when really we want China to move away from a centrally planned economy and move to more of a free market. But how do you read those tea leaves, if they are tea leaves at all, in terms of whether or not the Chinese are actually willing to come and make some progress on some of these other bigger issues?
Soybeans are important to our farmers. We are a big supplier of soybeans, but let me just say, this soybean issue has been exaggerated, and there's a little too much focus on just the purchase of soybeans. That's one of a lot of issues, and we're really focused, as we've talked about, on the structural issues. But the good news is the U.S. economy is doing terrific. We continue to have very strong jobs numbers. I think you've just begun to see the beginning of tax reform. I think you're going to see that kick in a lot again. And as the president talked about last night, his economic program is working. We're not going back to socialism. We're going on an economic plan for America that works.
In terms of the Chinese economy, we've certainly seen a slowdown, Mr. Secretary, and that has been viewed as leverage over the Chinese in making this deal. At what point, though, can you see that actually backfiring? Because a lot of U.S. companies clearly do business in China and feel that slowdown themselves, which then in turn hurts the U.S. economy. We live in a global world, and a slowdown in one of the fastest growing economies in the world certainly has effects elsewhere, including the U.S.
Well, there's no question there is a slowdown in China. I think a lot of that is somewhat inevitable, given various things that they are doing. But let me just emphasize, if we can get a good deal for U.S. companies, this is one of the single biggest opportunities. China has 1.3 billion people. There's a tremendous growing middle class. This is an enormous opportunity for U.S. companies to participate in that growth.
Is there a pain point, though, I guess is another way of asking this, Mr. Secretary, in terms of how much pain the Chinese economy feels because of those ongoing trade negotiations, and how much pain you see the U.S. economy suffering because of a China slowdown?
Well, I don't see the U.S. economy suffering a slowdown at this point at all. Matter of fact, the outlook is very strong. I was with a group of CEOs yesterday. They continue to have a very strong outlook on U.S. business. I think we've made a lot of progress already on trade, and I think the outlook for the economy this year is quite strong. Matter of fact, the U.S. is outperforming the rest of the world, and we continue to see a lot of capital coming into the U.S., creating more U.S. jobs, building U.S. factories. So we're quite pleased with that.